On December 10th, 2008, a man walked into his son's office and said, "It's all one big lie." That man had just stolen more money than the GDP of Ecuador. His name was Bernie Madoff. And the terrifying part? Almost nobody saw it coming for 48 years. Bernie Madoff wasn't some back-alley scammer. He was the former chairman of NASDAQ. He helped build the electronic trading system that Wall Street still uses today. Senators wanted to be in his fund. Hedge funds begged for access. Nobel Prize winners trusted him with their fortunes. So how does a man that respected end up confessing to the largest financial fraud in human history? Here's the scale of what we're talking about. $65 billion. That's not a typo. That's more than the annual budgets of 130 countries combined. Over 37,000 victims across 136 countries. Universities, charities, Holocaust survivors, people who handed Madoff their entire life savings and never saw a single penny returned. This isn't just a Wall Street story. This is a story about how trust becomes a weapon. Here's how a Ponzi scheme actually works and why Madoff's was so different from everyone before it. Most Ponzi's promise absurd returns, 200%, 500%, things that make even the greediest investor suspicious. Madoff promised 10 to 12% per year. Boring. Consistent. Every single year, rain or shine, bull market, bear market, didn't matter. That consistency is exactly what made people suspicious and then unsuspicious. Because when you questioned it, Madoff would shrug and say, "Fine, take your money back." And that response, that calm confidence, was the trick. Nobody ever actually took their money back, because leaving meant missing the next year's guaranteed 12%. Madoff ran a legitimate brokerage on floors 18 and 19 of the Lipstick Building in Manhattan. The firm was real. The trades on those floors were real. Floor 17 was different. Visitors weren't allowed. Employees on that floor didn't interact with the rest of the company. The 17th floor had its own entrance, its own staff, its own rules, and its own secrets. They used IBM ACE 400 computers from the 1980s, ancient machines that couldn't be networked to anything modern. Why? Because Madoff needed to generate fake trade confirmations. Real trades leave real digital trails. These machines left nothing. The man who ran floor 17 was Frank DePascali, a high school graduate from Queens who never got a college degree. His job? Manufacture reality. Every month, his team printed out statements showing trades that never happened, profits that never existed, insecurities that were never purchased. DePascali later testified that he knew it was wrong from nearly the beginning. His explanation for why he stayed: "I was making great money and I was afraid." That quote tells you everything about how a fraud this size actually operates, not through monsters, through ordinary people making ordinary compromises 1 month at a time. Remember those 48 years I mentioned at the start? Here's the part that should make you genuinely angry. A financial analyst named Harry Markopoulos figured out Madoff's fraud in less than 4 hours. He submitted a 17-page report to the SEC in the year 2000, 8 years before the collapse, titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." The SEC investigated and closed the case. Then he filed again. Closed. Again. Closed. 5 times total. 5 investigations, 0 convictions. One reason? Nobody wanted to believe it. When Markopoulos testified before Congress in 2009, he said, "I gift-wrapped and delivered the largest Ponzi scheme in history to the SEC, and somehow they couldn't be bothered to investigate properly. He also said he feared for his life. He kept his evidence in a safety deposit box with instructions, "If I disappear, open this." This wasn't paranoia. Madoff had connections, deep connections. And the SEC, many of its investigators hoped to one day work at the very firms that Madoff's clients ran, the same firms that funneled billions to him. That's called a regulatory capture problem. It means the people responsible for stopping fraud have professional incentives to not find it. And it is still unresolved today. But here's the structure that let Madoff scale to $65 billion in the first place. He didn't just take individual investors. He used feeder funds, firms that pooled money from hundreds of clients and handed it to Madoff wholesale. Firms like Fairfield Greenwich Group sent him $7.5 billion alone. In exchange, they collected fees for doing almost nothing, just funneling money in and collecting fake statements out. They either didn't know or didn't want to know. In securities law, that's called willful blindness. And it's a crime. By 2008, the global financial crisis was collapsing markets everywhere. Madoff's clients needed their money back. $7 billion in redemption requests hit in a single month. He only had $300 million in the bank. The math was over. He couldn't fake his way through this one. On December 10th, he called his sons Andrew and Mark into his apartment. He told them the investment advisory business was a giant Ponzi scheme. He asked for 1 week before they called authorities. They called the FBI the next morning. Now for the part nobody shows you. Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, lost his entire $15.2 million foundation to Madoff. He said, "We thought he was God. We trusted everything to him." Thousands of retirees received letters saying their life savings were gone. In the town of Fairfield, Connecticut, where one of Madoff's largest feeder funds was based, charities that funded cancer research, homeless shelters, and schools simply ceased to exist. A retired school teacher in Florida lost her entire $340,000 pension. The Technion University in Israel lost $72 million of its research fund. The fraud didn't just steal money, it deleted futures. And then there's what happened to Madoff's own family. His son, Mark, who turned him in, died by suicide on December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years after the arrest. His son, Andrew, died of cancer in 2014, saying the stress of the scandal had accelerated his illness. Bernie Madoff himself died in federal prison on April 14, 2021, at age 82. The lie outlived almost everyone it touched. Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in prison. Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee, has recovered $14.7 billion, about 80 cents on the dollar for net losers. That's actually unprecedented in the history of fraud recovery. Most victims of frauds this size get back 20 cents. Some get nothing. But here's what didn't change. The SEC still struggles with regulatory capture, feeder fund structures still exist, and the psychological mechanisms that made Madoff's fraud possible, the desire for exclusivity, the seduction of consistent returns, the reluctance to question authority, those haven't been legislated away. Because they're human. The most uncomfortable truth about Madoff isn't that he was a monster. It's that he was built by a system that rewarded him for being one. Wall Street's culture of opacity. A regulator afraid of embarrassing the industry. Wealthy investors who confused exclusivity with safety. If Madoff had been running a $3 million scheme out of a strip mall in Ohio, he'd have been caught in 3 years. The size of his fraud was itself the protection. He was too prestigious to be a criminal. Until he wasn't. And that moment, when prestige collapses into proof, is the only moment the system actually reacts. Not before. Not during. Only after the damage is already done. Because systems like this aren't designed to catch fraud early. They're designed to sustain trust for as long as possible. And that distinction matters. Because it means the burden of skepticism doesn't sit with regulators. It sits with individuals, investors, advisors, institutions that chose comfort over confrontation. Because the real warning signs were never hidden, they were simply inconvenient. Inconsistent returns, opaque strategies, tiny auditors, selective access. Signals that something wasn't just extraordinary, but mathematically impossible. And yet, thousands of sophisticated investors saw those signals and chose to rationalize them instead. That's the real lesson of Madoff. Not that fraud can be massive, but that it can feel safe. Before you go, one final thing. In a 2011 prison interview, Madoff said something that nobody in the financial press talked about enough. He said, the banks and hedge funds, they had to know. They just chose to look away. The FBI investigated. No major institution was ever charged. Think about that the next time someone tells you the system is designed to protect you. Sometimes the system is the Ponzi scheme. If you'd been offered access to Madoff's fund in 1995, would you have taken it? Be honest. If this made you think differently about how trust works in finance, the next video on Toys R Us story exposes how financial engineering can destroy even iconic companies. I'll link it. See you there.